The first Sunday of 2026 isn't just another square on the calendar, it's a doorway. And according to Padre Pio's stark, uncomfortable warnings, heaven is watching what you do with it. Not because God's sitting there with a checklist, but because how you begin reveals who you trust. You want provision this year? Real provision, not just money that slips through your fingers, but the kind that shows up exactly when the car breaks down, when the hospital bill comes, when you're 1 month from losing everything. Then you need to understand something Padre Pio would tell people who came to him desperate, broke, and exhausted. Did you invite God to your table, or just to your panic? Before we go any further, I want you to make a public commitment, not to me, but to the reality of your own home. If you are ready to stop inviting God only to your panic and start inviting him to your peace, type, "Lord, take your seat at my table," in the comments below. Don't just watch, respond. Let the spiritual world know that this year your house is no longer an open door for the enemy. Because here's what he saw over and over in the confessional: people who prayed when things fell apart, but never when things were ordinary. People who asked God to bless their year but wouldn't bless their bread. People who wanted heaven's protection but wouldn't give heaven a seat at the table. And it cost them, not in some vague spiritual way. It cost them in doctor visits that could have been avoided, in fights that shouldn't have happened, in money that evaporated for no logical reason, in years that felt like running on a treadmill, exhausting motion, zero progress. Padre Pio didn't do soft warnings. He did diagnostic precision. He looked at your life the way a surgeon looks at an X-ray and told you exactly where the fracture was. And for thousands of families, the fracture was this: they'd locked God out of the most ordinary, most powerful place in the house, the table. So before you roll your eyes and think this is about religion for religion's sake, ask yourself one question, one that Padre Pio would have asked you if you sat across from him. When was the last time your table heard a prayer? Not many people think of their kitchen table as contested ground, but that's exactly what it is. Padre Pio understood territorial warfare better than most theologians ever will, because he didn't just read about it, he lived it. The man bore the wounds of Christ in his flesh for 50 years. He wrestled with demons in his cell. He could smell the presence of evil on someone before they even opened their mouth to confess. And he kept coming back to this one warning over and over, like a doctor who sees the same preventable disease killing patient after patient. Where there is no blessing, there is no protection. Your table is either claimed or it's up for grabs. Look, I get it. You're slammed. Everyone's running on fumes. Between work, kids, bills, and everything else screaming for attention, the idea of some formal table blessing feels like one more thing on an impossible list. But here's the deal. Padre Pio wasn't talking about adding more to your plate. He was talking about protecting what's already there. Think about it. Where does your family actually gather? Not theoretically, actually. The living room, everyone's on their phones. The car, everyone's exhausted. The table is the last stand. It's where sustenance happens, where conversations could happen, where life gets lived in real time, not through screens. And the enemy knows this. He doesn't need to show up with fanfare. He just needs you to never invite God there. He needs you distracted, rushed, too busy to pray, too modern to bless. And then, slowly, that table stops being a place of communion and becomes just another surface where people refuel before going back to their separate corners. Padre Pio would look at you with those piercing eyes, the ones that made hardened criminals weep, and he'd say, "You're asking God to bless your year, but you won't bless your bread. You see the contradiction? The first Sunday of 2026 matters because beginnings matter, not symbolically, spiritually. Heaven operates on patterns, on declarations, on first fruits. The ancient Jews knew this. That's why they brought the firstborn lamb, the first harvest, the first everything to God. Not because God needed it, because they needed to remember who was the source. When you begin a year without acknowledging God at your table, you're making a statement. You might not mean to, but you are. You're saying, I've got this. You're saying, provision is my job. You're saying, I'll call on heaven when things break, but for now I'm good. And that's when the fractures begin. Not immediately, rarely immediately, but by March, by June, by the time you're staring at an empty bank account or a marriage that's gone cold or a kid who won't talk to you anymore, you'll wonder when it all started sliding. And the answer, the one Padre Pio would give you, is, it started when you didn't set the table right. Here's the distinction he kept hammering home. There's a difference between provision and survival. Survival is grinding. It's working 2 jobs and still being behind. It's having food but no peace. It's making it through but feeling like you're drowning. Survival is what happens when human effort is all you've got. Provision is different. Provision is when the money shows up the day before the bill is due. It's when the doctor finds nothing wrong after you were sure it was cancer. It's when your kid, the one who wouldn't listen, suddenly calls and says, "Can we talk?" Provision is God's fingerprints on your circumstances. It's grace in the details. And Padre Pio insisted that provision flows to homes where God is honored in the small things. Not just in crisis prayers, not just in church on Sunday, in the daily bread, in the ordinary moments, in the first Sunday of the year when you could easily just brunch and scroll. But instead you stop and say, this house belongs to God. You think the angels don't notice? Padre Pio taught that the angels are assigned to families, to homes, to specific people, and they're watching what you honor. They're seeing where you place your trust. The first days of the year aren't just calendar flips. They're spiritual mapping. What you prioritize in the beginning, you'll live out in the middle. If God gets your leftovers, leftover time, leftover attention, leftover reverence, then don't be surprised when the year feels like you're living on leftovers too. But if God gets the first seat, the first prayer, the first offering of bread blessed and broken at your table on the first Sunday of 2026, then you've set something in motion. You've declared ownership. You've invited protection. You've opened the door to provision that doesn't make sense on paper. Padre Pio had people come to him bankrupt, spiritually, emotionally, financially bankrupt, and he'd trace it back, always back, to the cracks in the foundation, to the prayers that stopped, to the tables where God used to be welcome but got slowly, politely, edged out by busyness and noise and the lie that we're self-sufficient. So let me ask you again, differently this time, who's sitting at your table right now? Is it worry? Is it distraction? Is it the weight of everything you're carrying alone? Or is there room for the one who said, I am the bread of life? Because if he's not there, you're fighting this year on your own. And Padre Pio would tell you bluntly, you're going to lose. Bread has always meant more than bread. Go back far enough and you'll find it everywhere God shows up. The Israelites wandering in the desert, starving, complaining, ready to mutiny. And God drops bread from the sky. Manna, every morning. Just enough for the day. The lesson wasn't about food. It was about dependence, about waking up and realizing you can't store grace. You can't hoard provision. You can only receive it, daily, humbly, from the hand that gives it. Then there's this moment in Genesis that should make your skin crawl with holy terror. Abraham's coming back from battle, bloody, exhausted, probably wondering if he just made the biggest mistake of his life. And out of nowhere appears Melchizedek. No introduction, no explanation, just this priest king standing there with bread and wine in his hands like he'd been waiting. Abraham, who argued with God, who laughed in God's face, falls silent, takes the bread, takes the wine, and receives a blessing that changes his bloodline forever. That bread wasn't a snack. It was a covenant sealed before his eyes. It was the visible proof that God doesn't just speak promises, he feeds them to you. And then Christ shows up and says the thing that made people walk away. I am the bread that came down from heaven. Not a metaphor, not poetry, a claim. Eat this, drink this, do this, remember. Padre Pio celebrated Mass every day. and people said watching him was like watching someone step through a doorway into another dimension. He would weep. His wounds would bleed through the bandages. The Mass would take hours because he couldn't rush through the consecration. The moment bread became body, wine became blood. For him it wasn't ritual. It was reality breaking through. And that's why he was so relentless about blessed bread in the home. Because he understood what most of us have forgotten. The table is the domestic echo of the altar. When you bless bread at your table, you're not playing church. You're acknowledging the same truth the Eucharist declares. Life comes from God, not from your effort. The first Sunday of 2026, Padre Pio would tell you to put bread at the center of your table, not because the bread itself has magic powers, but because the act of blessing it, offering it, breaking it with prayer is a declaration. You're saying to the principalities and powers, to the angels assigned to your home, to the enemy prowling for cracks, this house eats by the grace of God, and the enemy hates that. He doesn't hate your Netflix subscription. He doesn't care about your busy schedule. What he hates, what makes him recoil, is a family that stops, gathers, and prays over something as ordinary as bread. Because that gesture destroys his best lie. The lie that you're alone, that you're self-made, that your provision comes from your hustle, your degree, your strategy. Blessed bread at the table is theological warfare disguised as dinner. Padre Pio saw this play out in confession after confession, families in chaos, marriages falling apart, kids rebelling, money evaporating. And when he'd dig into their spiritual lives, the pattern was always there. Prayer had stopped, not dramatically, gradually. First it was, we're too tired to pray together. Then it was, we'll pray before bed. Then it was, I'll pray in the car. And then it was nothing. And into that nothing, everything else rushed in. Anxiety, resentment, sickness, lack. Not as punishment, as consequence. Because when you don't invite God to govern your table, something else will. And that something doesn't have your best interests in mind. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Padre Pio would ask the question nobody wants to hear. Who governs your table, anxiety or God? Because you can tell. You can tell by the conversations that happen there. Are they life-giving or life-draining? Are you actually connecting or just coexisting? Is there laughter or just the sound of silverware scraping plates while everyone counts the minutes until they can leave? The table reveals the state of the house. And if your table is governed by worry, by arguments about money, by stress about the future, by the emotional residue of everything going wrong, then you've given anxiety the seat of honor. You've made it the head of the household. And anxiety is a cruel master. It never stops demanding, it never provides, it just consumes. But when God governs the table, everything shifts. Not because problems disappear, but because the atmosphere changes. There's a settledness, a knowing that even when things are tight, they're not terminal. That even when the future is uncertain, it's not unguarded. That this house, this family, this table is covered by something bigger than what you can see. Padre Pio taught that the act of blessing bread on the first Sunday of the year sets a spiritual precedent. It's like laying a cornerstone. Everything that gets built after is affected by that foundation. If the foundation is, we trust God for our daily bread, then the year unfolds under that reality. Doors open that shouldn't. Money stretches further than math says it should. Health holds when it shouldn't. Not magic, provision. But if you skip it, if the first Sunday passes like any other Sunday, no prayer, no bread, no intentional surrender, then you've laid a different foundation, the foundation of self-reliance. And self-reliance always cracks under enough pressure. You know what Padre Pio never tolerated? People who wanted God's blessings but wouldn't give God their attention. He'd refuse absolution. He'd send them away, not out of cruelty, but because he knew you can't receive what you won't honor. The bread on your table the first Sunday of 2026 is about honor. It's about saying, before the year gets heavy, before the bills pile up, before the diagnosis comes, before the fight happens, God, you are the source. Not my job, not my savings, not my plan. You. And when that declaration is made, really made, not just mouthed, the enemy has to back up. Because he can't operate in a house where God is acknowledged as provider. He can tempt, he can whisper, but he can't rule. And that's the difference between a year you survive and a year you're carried through. So here's the second question, the one that cuts deeper. Are you actually ready to let God govern, or do you just want him on standby? All right, let's get practical. Because theology without action is just noise. And Padre Pio had zero patience for people who love talking about God, but wouldn't actually do what God asked. So here's what you do, not what you might do, not what would be nice to do. What you do on the first Sunday of 2026, if you're serious about this. You get bread, doesn't matter what kind. Sourdough, whole wheat, whatever's on sale at the grocery store. This isn't about artisan quality, it's about intention. One loaf, uncut, whole. Place it in the center of your table before anyone sits down. If you have a candle, light it. Put it next to the bread. Fire has always meant presence. Moses at the burning bush, the pillar of fire in the desert, the tongues of flame at Pentecost. You're creating a visual focus point, something that says, this moment is different. If you have holy water, from church, from a priest, blessed and kept in a small bottle somewhere in your house, bring it. Put it nearby, not as superstition, as sacramental, as a physical reminder that the spiritual realm is just as real as the kitchen you're standing in. Then, and this is the part people skip, you gather everyone who lives in that house, kids, teenagers, spouse, roommate, whoever. No phones, no TV murmuring in the background. No, I'll be there in a minute. You gather, because this isn't a solo act. This is a household declaration. And you stand there around the table in silence for a moment. Let the silence do its work. Let people feel awkward if they need to. Let the weight of the moment settle, because we live in a world that's terrified of silence, and silence is where God speaks loudest. Then someone prays. Doesn't have to be elaborate, doesn't have to be King James English. It can be raw, it can be simple, but it has to be real. Something like this. God, this bread represents everything that will come into this house in 2026. Every dollar, every meal, every breath, every decision. We're not putting it on the table because we think it's magic. We're putting it here because we know, without you, we've got nothing. Bless this bread, bless this house. Let this year be marked by your provision, your protection, and your presence. We surrender it to you, all of it. That's it. No performance, no trying to impress God, just honesty. After the prayer, if you have the holy water, make the sign of the cross over the bread. Trace it in the air, slowly, deliberately, in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. That cross is the signature of heaven. It's the mark that says, this belongs to God. Now here's what Padre Pio also recommended, and it might feel strange, but do it anyway. Take a piece of paper, write down your intentions for the year, the things you're afraid of, the people you're worried about, the situations that keep you awake at night, jobs, health, relationships, kids. Write them. Don't type them. Write them by hand. There's something about the physical act of writing that engages your will differently. Fold that paper, place it under the bread or next to the candle. Leave it there during the prayer. This isn't a wish list, it's an act of surrender. You're saying, God, I can't control these things, but you can. I'm handing them over. After the prayer, take the bread and break it. Not cut it with a knife, break it with your hands. Let everyone at the table take a piece and eat it together. In silence, or while someone reads a scripture, maybe the Lord's Prayer, maybe Psalm 23, maybe just John 6, where Jesus says, I am the bread of life. Share the bread. all of it. Don't save it for later. Don't wrap it up for sandwiches tomorrow. Consume it that day, because this is about communion, not preservation. And then, when it's done, when the bread is gone and the candle is still burning, you can talk. You can eat the rest of the meal. You can go back to normal life. But something has shifted. You've drawn a line. You've set a spiritual precedent. Padre Pio would tell people, do this and watch what God does. Not because God is a vending machine, but because when you honor him in the small things, he moves in the big things. When you give him the first Sunday, he guards the rest of the year. This isn't complicated, but it requires something most people won't give: intentionality. Most people will read this and think, that's beautiful, and do nothing. Don't be most people. Do it. Set the table, light the candle, bless the bread, and watch what heaven does when you finally give it room to work. Padre Pio didn't do motivational speeches. He did surgical truth, and the truth he kept encountering in the confessional was this: people waited until everything collapsed before they called on God. And by then, the damage was deep. He'd sit there listening to someone sob about their business failing, their marriage ending, their kids in trouble, their health deteriorating. And after they poured it all out, he'd ask them the question they didn't want to hear. When did you stop praying as a family? The answers were always the same. We got busy. The kids got older. We meant to, but... And Padre Pio would sit back, and those eyes that saw straight through excuses into the soul, would fix on them, and he'd say, you locked God out, and you're surprised the house fell apart. Harsh. Yes. True. Absolutely. Because here's what he understood that we've forgotten: spiritual neglect has consequences, real ones, measurable ones. Not because God is petty or vengeful, but because when you remove the foundation, the structure collapses. When you cut off the branch from the vine, it withers. That's not punishment, that's cause and effect. The families who came to Padre Pio weren't facing random bad luck. They were facing the accumulated weight of years without prayer, years without blessing, years of treating God like an emergency contact instead of a father. And the cracks had finally turned into craters. He'd tell them, you can't build a life on your own strength and expect it to stand when the storms come. It won't. It never does. And this is where the warning for the first Sunday of 2026 gets sharp. You still have time. Right now reading this, you have time. But time doesn't wait. The first Sunday will come whether you're ready or not. And if it passes without that bread, without that prayer, without that intentional act of surrender, you're not just missing a ritual, you're missing a door. Padre Pio knew really, that certain graces are tied to certain moments. Not because God is stingy, but because God honors what we honor. When we treat the beginning of a year as sacred, he meets us there. When we treat it as ordinary, we get ordinary results. And ordinary in a world this broken means grinding. It means exhaustion. It means wondering why nothing ever changes. The people who ignored Padre Pio's advice, who thought they were too modern or too busy or too rational for these old-fashioned practices, came back later, months later, years later, worse off than before. And he'd look at them with something between pity and frustration and say, I told you, the door doesn't stay open forever. That's the part nobody wants to talk about. We like to think God's grace is limitless, and it is, but our capacity to receive it isn't. We can get so hardened, so distracted, so self-sufficient, that even when God extends his hand, we don't see it. We've trained ourselves not to look. The first Sunday of 2026 is God extending his hand. You can take it or ignore it. But don't pretend, 6 months from now, when things are falling apart, that you weren't given the chance. Don't come to God in desperation and wonder why he feels distant. He's not distant. You just never invited him close. Padre Pio would say it bluntly. Grace is free, but it's not cheap. It costs you your pride, your self-reliance, your illusion of control. Are you willing to pay that price? Are you willing to set the table and mean it? Because if not, don't do it at all. God doesn't want your empty gestures. He wants your heart, your actual, messy, desperate heart that knows it can't do this alone. And if you give him that on the first Sunday at your table with bread and prayer and surrender, he'll move. He always does. Look, I don't know where you are right now. Maybe you're skeptical. Maybe you're desperate. Maybe somewhere in between. But if you've made it this far, something in you knows this matters. The first Sunday of 2026 is coming. You can let it pass like every other Sunday, or you can set the table, bless the bread, and watch what God does with a surrendered house. If this hit you, drop your intention in the comments. Lord, I surrender my finances. God, protect my family. Whatever it is, write it. Let this community pray with you. If you want to support this work, there's a super thanks button below. Close your eyes. 10 seconds. Padre Pio, teach me to trust God's provision. Help me set the table right. Don't let this Sunday slip by. God's waiting for your yes.